This lecturette focuses on conflict. Former U.S. President John F. Kennedy noted that when written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters. One represents danger and the other represents opportunity. Now, while you might disagree whether that is actually the case or not, there's no way to get around the fact that the ideogram does mean crisis and danger, or, as has been interpreted, a perilous situation when one should be especially wary. That definition could also apply to conflict. Today, we're going to focus on what conflict is, and this is part one of several lectures on the concept of conflict. This section is going to focus on the definitions of conflict, the various types of conflict. We'll explore the myths and benefits of conflict, and finally, how conflict can progress. Let's go through first the definition of conflict from Judith Jordan. She said that conflict arises when a difference between two or more people requires change in at least one person in order for their relationship to continue and develop. I want you to notice that this means that a change is necessary. It is required in order for the relationship to flourish or even be maintained. A second definition by Michael Dews from the University of Arizona, he says in order for conflict to occur, two things have to happen. The first is that people have to differ about something, so there must be a difference. And the second is that difference has to affect one or both of them. So Michael Dews might define conflict as a discomforting difference between two people. This is actually a good definition because it allows for the fact that if you agree or disagree, as long as it's not a discomfort to one or both people, then it's really not conflict. It also identifies that there may be degrees of discomfort. Let's move to types of conflict before we get back to yet another definition. The first is the difference between intrapersonal conflict versus interpersonal conflict. Intrapersonal conflict, intra means within, would be conflict within yourself. Maybe you're not satisfied with the way you are communicating with somebody, or you're frustrated with what's coming up. There's a conflict that makes you internally conflicted. It could be as simple as I'm having an issue with this other person, but I'm not sure that I want to express the issue. That would be another example of intrapersonal conflict. Interpersonal conflict is conflict within two or more people, and is usually in a dyad, a one-on-one situation, or a one-on-few situation. There's another concept of pseudo-conflict, which is also known as fake or false conflict. This is the belief that you are experiencing conflict because you do not understand each other. You do not understand what somebody might be saying. It's fundamentally a lack of understanding. You might think that there are incompatible goals or scarce resources that you're arguing over when in fact that's not the case. Simple conflict occurs when people have very real differences in ideas, definitions, perceptions, and goals. So in this case, you may still disagree with each other, but completely understand each other. This is the content of the conflict. And ego conflict is when things get personal. Partners become accusatory, they blame the other person, they start getting in name-calling and insults where the focus is on the person, not the content of the conflict or the behavior that's occurring. Keep in mind that pseudo-conflict and simple conflict can become ego conflicts if the people involved fail to keep focused on the issues and they allow their emotions to run wild. That leads us to a third definition of conflict. This is the one that is most often used in the area of interpersonal communication, where conflict can be viewed as an express struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, as well as interference from the other party in achieving those goals. So the first bullet says it's an expressed struggle. So that means that somebody has to express it. It can be expressed non-verbally as well as verbally, one or the other. So if somebody makes a comment and you roll your eyes, then you are expressing disagreement, that there may be a struggle perhaps for attention. between at least two interdependent parties, meaning that both of you mutually influence each other. In order for you to continue in your relationship, you are dependent upon the other person. The word perception in the third bullet allows you to understand that sometimes you don't have to have incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from the other party in achieving those goals, but all you often think of is that it is probably the case. You may not even check to see if it's of value, but you may still act as if you are in conflict and feel as if you are in conflict. You might perceive incompatible goals, meaning that we both can't get what we want. It looks like somebody has to lose, that what I want and what you want are mutually exclusive. Perceiving scarce resources, that there's not enough of something to go around. It could be tangible resources, money. It could be intangible resources, time, self-esteem. And you can perceive that the other person is going to prevent you, is going to interfere or challenge you with your ability to meet your goal. Turning next to conflict myths. These are things that are not true about conflict, but many people erroneously believe are true. The first is the concept that conflict is always bad, that when you're in conflict, it's a bad situation. And that's not always true, because many times you may be involved in a conflict, and because the conflict occurred, the aftermath of that conflict is better than if it never occurred before. Anybody who has ever broken up with somebody in a romantic relationship and after the fact felt that they were better off, that's a perfect example of how conflict can actually be good. Some people believe that conflict can always be avoided, which is clearly not true. If you close your eyes and pretend it doesn't exist, it doesn't always go away. Conflicts in life between friends, lovers, spouses, as well as in the workplace are absolutely inevitable, and you cannot avoid them. Some people believe that all conflict is pseudo-conflict, that if we completely understand each other, then all the problems will go away, and that's not necessarily true. Many people believe that if you argue with somebody, if you are in conflict with somebody, then there's something wrong with your relationship. And conflict is always a sign that a relationship is in trouble. Many families, the parents do not argue in front of the children because they don't want the children to think that their parents hate each other or there's going to be a divorce that's imminent. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, if you don't manage conflict, then you are probably going to end up with a poor interpersonal relationship. And many people also believe that every single conflict situation can be resolved. That's not necessarily true. In fact, we have changed the name of conflict resolution to conflict management to reflect the belief that we can manage conflicts if we can't always resolve them. There are many benefits of conflict as well. The first is that conflict focuses attention on problems requiring solving. You will not deal with the problems sometimes until a conflict occurs. The second is that conflict can clarify potential changes. You don't know what you have to do or what could be done that might improve the situation until you're dealing with it in a conflict. It can identify issues that are important to those people who are involved in the conflict. Sometimes you don't even know what's important to you until you're in a conflict. So you will learn about you and your values, as well as your partner and his or her values. Oftentimes in a conflict between people who are involved in, let's say, a romantic situation, somebody might say, well, I had no idea that was important to you. You're not going to learn that until you communicate about it, and that often happens in a conflict situation. When you successfully manage conflict, then oftentimes the relationship gets stronger because you know that you can withstand that kind of situation. And finally, you kind of need to have some conflict to keep the relationship interesting. There's a phrase from a song that says, along with the sunshine, there's got to be a little rain sometimes. In order for you to appreciate the relationship, you have to go through the conflict so that it's a more interesting relationship. Where does conflict come from? How does it progress? Well, first, conflict has to come from somewhere. The source is when you become aware of a behavior, a disagreement, a difference. It can come from a variety of sources: role expectations, perceptions, goals, resources, or a combination of things. For example, if somebody is coming home late at night, that can be a source of a conflict. The second stage, we move from the source to the beginning part of conflict. Frustration. You're now aware of the problem. So not only has this person come home late, but has come home late a lot of times, and now you're frustrated about it. The differences become problematic. You might become angry. There may be a conflict trigger, something that moves you to the next stage. In this part, you may have lots of self-talk. How do I handle this? Is it really a problem? Should I bring it up? Can I deal with this myself? So up to here, you're dealing with intrapersonal conflict because you haven't brought it to the other person's attention. When you do that, you move to middle conflict, otherwise known as active conflict. You express your struggle. You bring it to the attention of the other person. Again, it can be nonverbal or verbal expression of conflict. You move from here into the end part of it. Probably a bad word for this, but this is where you're actually working on resolving or managing the conflict. You're actually doing something about it. And finally, after the end, you move into the aftermath, where you have to follow up on it. You might want to check to make sure that what you have agreed upon in the management stage or the end stage is actually working. You might want to check to see if the other person is satisfied with the solution, or that you're satisfied with the solution. You may have to deal with hurt feelings, with fallout. All of this might happen after the conflict has been managed. Now, it looks like a very linear process, but oftentimes you loop back around. For example, you could express it in active conflict, work on it in the resolution, have to deal with the hurt feelings, and go back to the middle stage of conflict until you finally are satisfied with the solution. What are conflict sources and where do they come from? We've already addressed some of them. The first one that we want to remind ourselves is that conflict can happen as a result of conflicting goals or priorities. And sometimes it could happen because we have a lack of shared goals. A third time it can happen is because we don't know what our goals are. We don't always think about what our goals are. We have a vague understanding of it. There are some personality conflicts that occur as well. They're a common cause. Sometimes there's no chemistry between the two of you, or you haven't worked out an effective way to work with somebody else or to click with them. Sometimes there really are scarce resources when you're competing because there's not enough jobs to go around, or enough A's in a class, or there's not enough time in the day. We all have different communication styles. Your thinking style or communication style might conflict with somebody else's thinking style or their communication styles. However, once you realize what those are and you try to adapt to them, you can often manage conflict here. A harder area to manage conflict about is values. You may find a conflict in values. You have values that are very core to you. The other party has values that are very core to that person. Dealing with those is very difficult. So values can be an issue. Now it's time to process some of this information. So first question for you is, which of the three definitions that we talked about best exemplifies your view of conflict? From your perspective, which conflict myth is the most accepted by those people whom you come in contact with? And finally, think about your most recent conflict and ask yourself what you thought the primary source of the conflict was. Was it a single source, or was it a combination of sources? We will go more into how to manage conflict in the next video.